It was a quiet evening at Joe's Tavern, a small bar tucked away on the edge of Los Angeles. The place wasn't fancy. It had wooden floors that creaked when you walked, dim yellow lights hanging from the ceiling, and walls covered in faded posters of old rock bands. But it didn't need to be fancy. It was the kind of spot where people came to forget about their troubles, even if just for a little while. Carl, the bartender, was wiping down glasses behind the counter. He'd been working there for 20 years and he knew most of the regulars by name. At one corner of the room near the jukebox sat Bruce Lee. He wasn't flashy or loud like some of the other customers. Instead, he kept to himself, sipping on a cold drink and watching the world go by. Bruce wasn't there to make friends or cause trouble. After spending hours teaching martial arts and training his body, he just wanted a moment of peace. Sometimes being alone felt like the best way to recharge. The air inside the bar was calm, almost sleepy. A couple of guys were playing pool at the far end of the room, laughing and joking as they leaned over the table. Emily, the young waitress with curly brown hair, moved between tables, carrying trays of food and drinks. She glanced toward Bruce every now and then. There was something about him, his focus, his quiet confidence that made her curious. Most people who came to Joe's Tavern were either too tired from work or too drunk to notice much. But Bruce seemed different. He carried himself differently, like someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. But all of that changed the moment the door swung open. A group of bikers walked in, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. They weren't locals. No one recognized them. Their leather jackets were scuffed and patched and chains jangled around their waists. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard named Jake, strode straight up to the bar. His voice boomed across the room as he ordered a round of beers. "Make it quick," he barked at Carl, slapping a wad of cash onto the counter. His crew, Tommy, Rick, and two others whose names no one caught, spread out, taking up space like they owned the place. Jake scanned the room, his eyes narrowing slightly when they landed on Bruce. Maybe it was because Bruce looked so relaxed, sitting there alone without a care in the world, or maybe it was because he didn't flinch when Jake locked eyes with him. Whatever the reason, Jake didn't like it. He turned to his friends and muttered something under his breath, then smirked. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The bikers laughed loudly, cracking crude jokes and shoving each other playfully. They acted like they were putting on a show, making sure everyone in the bar noticed them. Emily hurried past them, avoiding eye contact. Even Carl, usually unshakable, seemed uneasy as he poured their drinks. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing second. Then it happened. One of the bikers, a wiry guy with tattoos covering both arms, stumbled backward, bumping into Bruce's table. The glass Bruce had been drinking from toppled over, spilling its contents everywhere. For a moment, the whole bar went silent. Everyone turned to see how Bruce would react. Bruce didn't move right away. He looked down at the mess, then slowly raised his gaze to meet the bikers. "Excuse me," he said calmly, his voice steady and clear. The biker blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected such a mild response. Grinning nervously, he mumbled an apology and stepped back, returning to his friends. But Jake wasn't satisfied. He pushed off the bar and sauntered over to Bruce's table. Standing above him, he crossed his arms and sneered. "You got a problem, buddy?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Bruce looked up at him unfazed. "No problem," he replied. "Just cleaning up." Jake frowned. He hadn't expected this kind of answer either. Normally, when he picked fights, people either backed down immediately or got angry enough to lash out. Bruce's calm demeanor threw him off balance. Still, Jake wasn't about to let it slide. He reached down and grabbed Bruce by the collar, yanking him halfway out of his seat. "Listen, shorty," Jake growled. "You better watch your mouth." Bruce didn't resist. He simply stared back at Jake, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, he said, "Respect is earned." That was all it took. Jake's face turned red with rage. He shoved Bruce back into his seat and turned to his crew, motioning for them to surround him. The mood in the bar shifted instantly. What had started as a minor accident was quickly escalating. into something much bigger. Emily froze where she stood, clutching her tray tightly. She glanced at Carl, hoping he might intervene, but the older man shook his head subtly. This wasn't his fight. The pool players abandoned their game, retreating to the corners of the room to watch from a safe distance. No one dared to speak. Yet despite the mounting tension, Bruce remained completely composed. He adjusted his shirt, smoothed out the wrinkles, and stood up slowly. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he were preparing for a demonstration rather than a brawl. When he finally faced Jake and his gang, there was no fear in his eyes, only determination. Jake cracked his knuckles and grinned. "All right. Tough guy," he said. "Let's see what you're made of." What happened next would leave everyone in the bar speechless and change the course of several lives forever. Jake's grin widened as he stepped closer to Bruce, his confidence swelling. He glanced at his crew, who were already cracking their knuckles and flexing their muscles, ready to back him up. In Jake's mind, this was going to be an easy victory. Bruce was smaller than all of them, lean and wiry compared to the bikers' bulky frames. To Jake, it looked like he was dealing with someone who didn't stand a chance. But Bruce wasn't intimidated. He stood there calmly, his feet planted, firmly on the ground, his hands relaxed at his sides. His posture was relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring waiting to snap into action. The other people in the bar held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Emily, the waitress, clutched her tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. Carl, the bartender, stopped wiping glasses and leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. "You think you're tough, huh?" Jake taunted, leaning in close to Bruce. His breath smelled of alcohol and cigarettes. "You don't belong here, little man. Maybe you should just walk away before things get ugly." Bruce didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, letting the tension in the room settle. Then in a calm and measured voice he said, "I'm not looking for trouble, but I won't run from it either." Jake laughed, a loud, mocking sound that echoed through the bar. "Big words for such a small guy," he sneered. He turned to his friends, gesturing toward Bruce. "Did you hear that? This guy thinks he's got guts." The bikers chuckled nervously, though none of them seemed entirely comfortable with the situation. There was something about Bruce's demeanor that made them uneasy, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on it. The biker with tattoos, the one who had bumped into Bruce's table earlier, stepped forward, eager to prove himself. "Let me handle this, Jake," he said, rolling up his sleeves. Without warning, he lunged at Bruce, aiming a wild punch at his face. Bruce moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. As the tattooed biker swung, Bruce sidestepped effortlessly, dodging the blow with ease. The momentum of the missed punch sent the biker stumbling forward, off balance. Before he could recover, Bruce delivered a quick, precise strike to the back of his knee, causing him to collapse onto the floor with a thud. The entire bar gasped. No one expected Bruce to move so quickly or so effectively. Even Jake looked surprised, though he tried to hide it behind another sneer. "Lucky shot," he muttered, stepping forward to take matters into his own hands. Rick, another member of the gang, decided to join the fray. He charged at Bruce from the side, hoping to catch him off guard. But Bruce saw him coming. With a fluid motion, he spun around, using Rick's own momentum against him. Grabbing the biker's arm, Bruce twisted it gently but firmly, forcing Rick to spin in place and fall awkwardly onto a nearby table. Glasses shattered, and the table groaned under the weight of the impact. By now, the rest of the bikers were getting nervous. They exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to proceed. Jake, however, refused to back down. He clenched his fists and shouted, "Get him!" His command spurred the remaining members of the gang into action. Two of them rushed at Bruce, simultaneously, trying to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. Bruce remained calm, his movements precise and calculated. He ducked under one attacker's swinging fist, then used his forearm to block the other's attempt to grab him. In one smooth motion, he pivoted on his heel and delivered a sharp kick to the first biker's chest, sending him stumbling backward. The second biker tried to tackle Bruce, but Bruce simply stepped aside, letting the man crash into a wall instead. The fight was chaos, but only for the bikers. For Bruce, it was almost like a dance. He flowed between his attackers, avoiding, Their clumsy blows while delivering swift, controlled strikes of his own. Each movement he made was efficient, designed not to harm unnecessarily but to neutralize the threat. It was clear to everyone watching that Bruce wasn't fighting out of anger or malice. He was defending himself with skill and discipline. Emily watched in awe, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd never seen anything like it before. Most fights she'd witnessed ended in bloodshed and broken bones, but this was different. Bruce wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was simply stopping them from hurting him. It was almost poetic the way he moved. Carl, too, was impressed. He'd heard rumors about Bruce's abilities, but seeing them firsthand was something else, entirely. That guy's got skills, he murmured to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. Meanwhile, Jake was growing increasingly frustrated. He couldn't understand how Bruce was holding his own against 5 grown men. Every time one of his crew attacked, they ended up flat on their backs or sprawled across the furniture. Jake clenched his jaw, his pride wounded. He couldn't let this continue, not in front of his gang. If he did, he'd lose face and respect. Enough of this, Jake roared, storming toward Bruce. He grabbed a metal pipe that had been leaning against the wall and brandished it like a weapon. You want to play games? Fine. Let's see how you handle this. Bruce paused for a moment, assessing the situation. The pipe added a dangerous element to the fight, and he knew he had to be careful, but he didn't panic. Instead, he lowered his stance slightly, preparing himself for whatever came next. Jake swung the pipe with all his strength, aiming for Bruce's head. The blow was powerful, but Bruce was faster. He ducked beneath the swing, closing the distance between them before Jake could react. With lightning speed, Bruce caught Jake's wrist, twisting it until the pipe clattered to the floor. Jake winced, in pain, struggling to pull away, but Bruce held firm. For a brief moment, the 2 men locked eyes. Jake's expression was a mix of fear and disbelief, while Bruce's remained calm and resolute. This doesn't have to end badly, Bruce said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise of the bar. Walk away. Jake hesitated, torn between his pride and the reality of the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded reluctantly. Bruce released his grip and Jake stumbled backward, rubbing his sore wrist. The other bikers scrambled to their feet, gathering around their leader. None of them dared to make another move. The fight was over, and they all knew it. As the tension in the room began to ease, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Carl resumed wiping down glasses, though his hands were still trembling slightly. And Bruce? He simply straightened his shirt, brushed off some imaginary dust and returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. The silence in the bar was deafening. The silence in the bar was heavy, almost suffocating. Everyone stared at Bruce, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. No one spoke. Even the bikers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Jake, still rubbing his sore wrist, looked around at his crew. They were battered, bruised, and clearly shaken. None of them had expected this outcome. In their minds, they had walked into Joe's tavern as the toughest guys in the room. Now they felt like amateurs who had been outmatched by someone who didn't even seem to be trying. Bruce sat back down at his table, calm and composed. He picked up his glass only to realize it had spilled during the scuffle. With a small sigh, he set it aside and leaned back in his chair. His breathing was steady, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, it seemed like he hadn't just taken on 5 men single-handedly. It was as if the entire fight had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Jake finally broke the silence. What are you?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The question hung in the air, raw and honest. It wasn't just about Bruce's physical abilities. It was about the way he carried himself, the way he fought without malice or anger. Jake had spent years picking fights, throwing punches, and asserting dominance. But Bruce? He didn't fit into any category Jake understood. Bruce tilted his head slightly, considering the question. After a moment, he replied, "I'm someone who believes in control, not chaos." His words were simple, yet they carried weight. Fighting isn't about proving who's stronger. It's about understanding yourself and knowing when to stop. Jake frowned, processing the response. He glanced at his crew, then back at Bruce. There was something in Bruce's tone that made him pause, something genuine. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt uncertain. He wasn't used to feeling this way. Most people either feared him or respected him out of intimidation. Bruce, however, didn't fall into either category. He wasn't afraid of Jake, but he also wasn't mocking him. If anything, Bruce seemed disappointed. One of the bikers, Rick, stepped forward hesitantly. "You could have hurt us worse," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Why didn't you?" Bruce turned his gaze toward Rick, studying him for a moment. Then, with a faint smile, he said, "Hurting others doesn't make me stronger, it makes me weaker. True strength comes from knowing when not to use force." Rick blinked, surprised by the answer. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, he exchanged glances with his friends. None of them knew how to respond. They were used to violence being a tool for power or revenge. Bruce's philosophy was foreign to them, a concept they couldn't quite wrap their heads around. Emily, the waitress, decided to break the tension. She approached Bruce cautiously, carrying a fresh drink on her tray. "Here," she said softly, placing it on the table in front of him. "On the house." Bruce looked up at her and nodded politely. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm. Emily smiled nervously before stepping back. She wanted to say more, to ask questions, to express her admiration, but she held herself back. Something about Bruce's presence commanded respect, even from those who barely knew him. Carl, the bartender, leaned over the counter and called out to Jake. "You boys done causing trouble?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. "Because I'd rather not have to call the cops tonight." Jake hesitated. Part of him wanted to argue, to salvage whatever scraps of pride he had left. But another part, the bigger part, knew there was no point. He glanced at his crew again, then back at Bruce. Finally, he muttered, "Yeah, we're done." Without another word, he gestured for his gang to follow him toward the door. As they filed out of the bar, the other patrons watched silently. Some looked relieved, while others appeared thoughtful. The bikers' departure felt like the end of a storm, calm returning after chaos. When the door slammed shut behind them, the room exhaled collectively. For a few moments, no one moved. Then, slowly, life began to return to the bar. The pool players resumed their game, though their laughter was subdued. Carl went back to wiping glasses, shaking his head as if trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Emily lingered near Bruce's table, torn between curiosity and shyness. Finally, she found the courage to speak. "That was amazing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you learn to fight like that?" Bruce took a sip of his drink before answering. "Years of practice," he said simply, "and a lot of patience." Emily frowned slightly. "But why? Why put so much effort into learning something like that?" Bruce set his glass down and looked at her thoughtfully. "Because martial arts isn't just about fighting," he explained. "It's about discipline, focus, and self-control. It's about becoming the best version of yourself, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually too." Emily nodded slowly, though she still looked puzzled. "I guess I don't really understand," she admitted, "but I think it's incredible." Bruce chuckled softly. "You don't have to understand everything right away," he said. "Sometimes, it's enough to just appreciate the moment." Before Emily could respond, the door to the bar swung open again. This time, it wasn't the bikers returning. It was a man named Steve, one of the regulars. He stopped short when he saw the mess. In the room, overturned chairs, shattered glass, and a broken table. "What happened here?" he asked, looking around in confusion. Carl sighed and waved a hand dismissively. "Just another night at Joe's," he said dryly. Steve raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he took his usual seat at the bar and ordered a beer. Life at Joe's Tavern was always unpredictable, and tonight was no exception. As the evening wore on, The atmosphere in the bar gradually returned to normal. People talked, laughed, and drank, leaving the earlier incident behind. But for Bruce, the night wasn't over yet. He stayed seated at his table, lost in thought. The encounter with the bikers had been brief, but it reminded him of why he dedicated his life to martial arts. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about making a difference, even in small ways. Eventually, Bruce stood up and placed some money on the table to pay for his drink. He nodded at Carl and gave Emily a polite smile before heading toward the door. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him, clearing his mind. The streets were quiet now, the chaos of the bar fading into the background. Little did Bruce know, the impact of what had happened inside Joe's Tavern would ripple far beyond that single night. For Jake and his gang, the encounter would leave a lasting impression, one that would change the course of their lives in unexpected ways. And for the people who had witnessed it, the memory of Bruce's calm strength would stay with them forever, a reminder that true power lies not in domination, but in understanding. The next morning, the sun rose over Los Angeles, casting a golden glow across the city. Life went on as usual for most people. Cars honked in traffic, shopkeepers opened their doors, and children headed to school. But for Jake and his gang, things felt different. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on their minds, lingering like a shadow they couldn't shake. Jake sat alone at a diner booth, staring into a cup of black coffee. His reflection in the shiny surface of the table looked tired, almost defeated. He hadn't slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Bruce's calm face staring back at him. It wasn't just the fight that bothered him. It was the way Bruce had acted afterward. No gloating, no threats, nothing. Just words. Words that made Jake question everything he thought he knew about strength and power. Rick slid into the seat across from him, snapping Jake out of his thoughts. "You okay, man?" Rick asked, his voice low. He glanced around the nearly empty diner before continuing. "You've been quiet since last night." Jake sighed and leaned back in the booth. "I don't get it," he admitted, running a hand through his thick beard. "That guy, he could have crushed us if he wanted to. Why didn't he?" Rick shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Maybe he's just weird, or maybe he's smarter than we are." "Smarter?" Jake repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Rick hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Think about it, Jake. We always use our fists first, right? That's how we solve problems, but this guy, he didn't even seem mad. Like, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just doing what he had to do." Jake frowned, processing Rick's observation. Deep down, he knew there was truth in it. For years, Jake had relied on intimidation and brute force to get what he wanted. It had worked, most of the time anyway. But last night, none of that mattered. Bruce hadn't been afraid of them, and he hadn't needed to throw wild punches to win. His movements were precise, controlled, almost artistic, and when the fight was over, he hadn't rubbed it in their faces. Instead, he'd offered them a lesson, one Jake wasn't sure he fully understood yet. What do you think he meant when he said true strength comes from knowing when not to use force? Jake muttered, more to himself than to Rick. Rick scratched the back of his neck, clearly unsure how to respond. "I don't know, man. Maybe it means being strong isn't just about hitting hard. Maybe it's about having control over yourself, like knowing when to stop." Jake stared at him, surprised by the insight. "When did you start thinking so deep?" Rick chuckled nervously. "Hey, I'm just saying what I see. You're the one who's all messed up about this." Before Jake could reply, Tommy walked into the diner, followed by the two other members of their gang. They looked equally disheveled, their usual swagger replaced by unease. Without speaking, they joined Jake and Rick in the booth, filling the space with silence. Finally, Tommy broke it. "So, what now?" he asked, glancing at Jake. "Do we just forget about last night?" "Forget it?" Jake echoed, shaking his head. "How can we forget something like that? That guy, he changed something. I don't know what, but..." He trailed off, unable to find the right words. Tommy exchanged glances with the others, then said, "Maybe he gave us a chance to do better." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Do better? What are you talking about?" Tommy shrugged. "Look, we've been jerks for a long time. We push people around, pick fights, act like we own the place wherever we go. And for what? To feel tough, to scare people? Last night that guy showed us there's another way. Maybe we should try it." The idea hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. None of them were used to thinking about their actions, or considering whether they could change. But after meeting Bruce, something inside them had shifted. They weren't ready to admit it out loud, but they all felt it, a desire to be better. Meanwhile, back at Joe's Tavern, Emily arrived early to help clean up the mess from the night before. Broken glass crunched under her shoes as she swept the floor, while Carl wiped down tables and straightened chairs. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. Both were still processing what they'd witnessed. "You ever seen anything like that before?" Carl asked, eventually breaking the silence. Emily shook her head. "Nope. Never. That guy, he was incredible." Carl nodded, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Yeah, he's something else. Reminds me of those old kung fu movies I used to watch when I was a kid. You know, where the hero takes on 50 guys without breaking a sweat?" Emily laughed softly. "Yeah, except this wasn't a movie. It was real life." As she swept, her mind kept drifting back to Bruce. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he handled the situation without losing his cool. Most people would have been angry or scared, but Bruce had stayed calm and collected. It made her wonder, how did someone become like that? Was it natural, or did it take practice? Her thoughts were interrupted when the door creaked open. Expecting another customer, Emily turned around, but instead of a stranger, she saw Steve, one of the regulars. He waved awkwardly as he stepped inside. "Morning," he greeted, taking a seat at the bar. "Place looks like it survived the apocalypse." Carl chuckled and slid him a cup of coffee. "Close enough," he replied. "You missed quite the show last night." Steve raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What happened?" Carl filled him in on the details, describing the bikers' arrival, the fight, and Bruce's unexpected victory. Steve listened intently, his expression shifting from surprise to admiration. When Carl finished, Steve whistled softly. "Sounds like that guy's got some serious skills," he remarked. "Do you think he'll come back?" "I doubt it," Carl said with a shrug. "Guys like him don't stick around places like this for long." Emily didn't say anything, but she secretly hoped Bruce would return. There was something about him that intrigued her, not just his martial arts abilities, but his philosophy, his calm demeanor. She felt like there was so much more to learn from him, even though they'd barely spoken. Later that day, Jake and his gang gathered outside their favorite hangout spot, a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. They stood in a loose circle, each lost in their own thoughts. After a long moment of silence, Jake cleared his throat. "Listen," he began, his voice firm but uncertain. "I've been thinking about what happened last night, about what that guy said, and I think maybe we've been going about things the wrong way." His crew exchanged surprised glances. This wasn't the Jake they knew, the brash, reckless leader who thrived on chaos. Something had changed in him, and they could see it in his eyes. "We don't have to keep being bullies," Jake continued. "We don't have to hurt people or cause trouble just because we can. Maybe we can actually do some good for once." The others nodded slowly, their expressions thoughtful. It was a strange feeling, like stepping into uncharted territory. For years, they'd defined themselves by their toughness, their willingness to fight. Now, they were considering a new path, one that involved respect and responsibility. "What do you propose we do?" Tommy asked cautiously. Jake hesitated, then said, "Start small. Help clean up the neighborhood. Volunteer at the shelter downtown. Show people we're not just a bunch of thugs." To everyone's surprise, the idea didn't sound so bad. In fact, it sounded kind of exciting. For the first time in a long time, they felt hopeful. Not just about themselves, but about the future. As they dispersed, Jake lingered behind, staring at the horizon. He didn't know if they could truly change, but he was willing to try. And deep down he knew it was all because of one man who had shown them a different way. Little did Jake realize, his decision would have far-reaching consequences, not just for his gang, but for the entire community. The days that followed seemed to pass in a blur for Jake and his gang. At first, their decision to change felt awkward, almost unnatural. For years, they had defined themselves by their rough edges, their leather jackets, loud bikes, and intimidating presence. Now they were trying something completely new, and it wasn't easy. But Jake was determined. He remembered Bruce's words clearly. True strength comes from knowing when not to use force. Those words echoed in his mind every time he felt the urge to fall back into old habits. Their first step was small but meaningful. They showed up at a local park one Saturday morning, armed with trash bags and gloves. The park had been neglected. For months, its once green grass now littered with soda cans, candy wrappers, and broken bottles. A few families watched warily as Jake and his crew began picking up trash. Some people whispered to each other, wondering what the bikers were up to. Others kept their distance, unsure whether this was some kind of trick. But Jake didn't care about the stares or the whispers. He focused on the task at hand, filling bag after bag with garbage. His crew worked alongside him, their usual swagger replaced by quiet determination. By the end of the day, the park looked cleaner than it had in years. A little girl approached Jake shyly, holding out a dandelion she'd picked. "Thank you," she said softly before running back to her mother. Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the flower in his hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant more to him than any fight or victory ever had. For the first time, in a long time, he felt like he was doing something worthwhile. Word of the bikers' effort spread quickly through the neighborhood. People were skeptical at first, but as the days turned into weeks, they began to notice a difference. Jake and his gang started showing up at community events, helping serve meals at the shelter, painting over graffiti on buildings, even assisting elderly residents with yard work. Their actions weren't flashy or dramatic, but they were consistent. Slowly but surely, the community began to trust them. One afternoon, as Jake pushed a wheelbarrow full of mulch for an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, she stopped him with a smile. "You boys have really changed," she said, leaning on her cane. "I never thought I'd say this, but, thank you." Jake grinned sheepishly. "We're just trying to make things better," he replied. "Still got a long way to go, though." Mrs. Harper patted his arm. "Well, keep it up. You're proving that anyone can turn things around if they really want to." Her words stuck with Jake long after he left her house. He realized that their transformation wasn't just about fixing the neighborhood. It was about fixing themselves. Each act of kindness, no matter how small, chipped away at the walls they had built around their hearts. They weren't perfect and they still made mistakes, but they were learning, and that was enough. Back at Joe's Tavern, life continued as usual. Carl polished glasses behind the bar while Emily served drinks and took orders. The memory of Bruce's visit lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the night that had changed everything. Though Bruce hadn't returned, his presence was still felt, not just by Emily and Carl, but by everyone who had witnessed the fight. One evening, a group of locals gathered at the bar to talk about the recent changes in the neighborhood. Someone mentioned Jake and his gang, and the conversation quickly turned lively. "Did you hear they cleaned up the park last weekend?" one man asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never thought I'd see those guys picking up trash." Another chimed in. "And they helped rebuild the playground at the elementary school. My kid says they even stayed late to paint the swings." Emily listened quietly as she refilled drinks. She couldn't help but smile. Part of her wondered if Bruce knew about the impact he'd had on Jake and his crew. Would he be proud, or would he simply nod and say it was what he expected all along? Carl noticed her thoughtful expression and leaned over the counter. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked with a grin. Emily shrugged. "Just thinking about that guy, Bruce. Do you think he knew what he was starting that night?" Carl chuckled. "Hard to say, but if you ask me, that's the kind of person he is. Someone who plants seeds without needing to see them grow." Emily nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe that's why he didn't stick around. He didn't need the credit. He just wanted to show people a better way. Meanwhile, Jake and his gang were becoming fixtures in the community. They weren't heroes, and they didn't pretend to be. But they were making a difference, one small action at a time. Their motorcycles no longer roared through the streets late at night, disturbing the peace. Instead, they parked quietly outside, shelters and community centers ready to lend a hand wherever it was needed. One day, as Jake walked through the park he had helped clean, he spotted a familiar face sitting on a bench. It was Steve, the regular from Joe's Tavern. Steve waved him over, and Jake hesitated for a moment before joining him. "You've been busy," Steve said with a grin. "Heard you've been turning this place around." Jake shrugged modestly. "Just trying to give back, you know? Make up for some of the stuff we've done." Steve nodded approvingly. "It's good to see. People are talking about it. You and your crew. You're changing the way they think about bikers." Jake smiled faintly. "That's the idea. We're not perfect, but we're working on it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching children play on the swings and couples stroll along the paths. The park felt alive again, full of laughter and energy. Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not because he had accomplished something great, but because he had contributed to something bigger than himself. As the weeks turned into months, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey they had taken. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when doubt crept in, when old habits threatened to resurface. But every time that happened, he reminded himself of Bruce's calm demeanor, his quiet confidence. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not anymore. What mattered was the example he set, the lives he touched. One evening, as Jake stood outside the garage where his crew often gathered, he looked up at the stars. The sky was clear, and the air smelled fresh. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He didn't know if he would ever see Bruce again, but he hoped the man knew how much of an impact he had made. "Thanks," Jake whispered to the night, though no one was there to hear him. "For showing us another way." Little did Jake realize, his gratitude wasn't misplaced. Across the city, Bruce Lee sat on a balcony overlooking Los Angeles, lost in thought. He didn't need to hear Jake's words to know that his message had been received. Sometimes, all it took was planting a seed and letting others find their own path to growth. Months passed, and the changes in Jake's life and the lives of his gang became impossible to ignore. What had started as small acts of kindness had grown into something much larger. They weren't just cleaning parks or helping neighbors anymore. They were becoming role models for others in the community. People who once avoided them now greeted them with smiles. Parents no longer pulled their children away when the bikers walked by. Instead, kids waved at them, calling out their names like old friends. Jake still found it hard to believe sometimes. He remembered the days when fear was the only thing he inspired in others. Back then, respect had been measured by how many people you could intimidate. Now he realized true respect came from earning trust, not demanding it. It was a lesson he carried with him every day, one that reminded him of Bruce's calm strength. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch of his small apartment, he reflected on how far they'd come. His crew had gathered around him, sharing stories and laughter like they always did. But tonight felt different. There was a sense of pride in the air, not just for what they had accomplished, but for who they had become. Rick leaned back in his chair holding up a beer bottle. "You know," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that guy." Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, Bruce. I wonder if he knows what happened after he left." Tommy chimed in, scratching his chin thoughtfully. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe what he did was enough." The group fell silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. None of them needed to say it aloud. They all knew Bruce had changed them in ways they couldn't have imagined. He hadn't just taught them how to fight better or control their tempers. He had shown them the power of discipline, patience, and self-respect. Those lessons were worth more than any victory in a barroom brawl. Across town, Emily stood behind The counter at Joe's Tavern, polishing glasses absent-mindedly. The bar was quieter than usual, giving her time to think. She often wondered about Bruce, too. Where was he now? Was he teaching martial arts somewhere else? Inspiring other people the way he had inspired Jake and his gang? She wished she could thank him, not just for what he had done for the bikers, but for the ripple effect it had created in the entire neighborhood. Carl noticed her distant expression and chuckled softly. "Still thinking about him?" he asked, leaning against the counter. Emily smiled sheepishly. "Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? One person can change so much without even realizing it." Carl nodded knowingly. "That's how it works sometimes. You plant a seed and someone else waters it. Before you know it, there's a whole garden." Emily liked that analogy. It made her feel hopeful, like maybe everyone had the potential to make a difference, even if it seemed small at first. She glanced around the bar, taking in the familiar faces of regulars chatting and laughing. The place felt alive again, full of warmth and connection. In its own way, Joe's Tavern had been transformed too, thanks to the events of that unforgettable night. Bruce, meanwhile, continued his journey. He traveled across the country, teaching martial arts and spreading his philosophy of peace and self-control. To those who met him, he was a teacher, a mentor, and sometimes even a friend. But he never sought recognition or fame. For Bruce, the reward lay in seeing others grow stronger, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. One afternoon, while visiting a small dojo in San Francisco, Bruce overheard two students talking. One of them mentioned a story he'd heard about a martial artist who had single-handedly taken down a biker gang in Los Angeles. The student spoke with admiration, describing how the man had used his skills not to hurt, but to teach. Bruce listened quietly, a faint smile playing on his lips. He didn't need to confirm whether the story was about him. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the message had spread. Later that evening, as Bruce sat alone in his hotel room, he thought about the impact of his actions. He knew he couldn't change the world overnight, but he believed in the power of small moments. Every word spoken, every movement demonstrated, every act of kindness given, all of it added up. And though he might never meet the people whose lives he touched, he trusted that his teachings would live on through them. Back in Los Angeles, Jake decided it was time to take things a step further. He gathered his crew and pitched an idea, starting a program to mentor at-risk youth in the community. "We've been through some tough stuff," he told them. "Maybe we can help kids avoid making the same mistakes we did." The idea was met with enthusiasm. Together, they reached out to local schools and community centers, offering free workshops on conflict resolution, teamwork, and personal responsibility. At first, turnout was slow. Many parents were hesitant to let their children near a group of former troublemakers. But as word spread about the positive influence Jake and his gang were having, more families began to participate. One Saturday morning, Jake stood in front of a group of teenagers at a community center gym. They eyed him warily, unsure what to expect. Jake smiled warmly, trying to put them at ease. "I'm not here to lecture you," he began. "I'm here because I was once where you are now. I made a lot of bad choices, but I also learned how to turn things around. If I can do it, so can you." The teens exchanged glances, intrigued. Over the next few hours, Jake and his crew led exercises designed to build trust and communication. By the end of the session, the room buzzed with energy. Some of the kids lingered afterward, asking questions and sharing their own struggles. Jake listened patiently, offering advice when needed. He knew these conversations wouldn't solve everything overnight, but they were a start. As the months turned into years, the legacy of that night at Joe's Tavern continued to grow. Jake and his gang became pillars of the community, known not for their past mistakes but for their determination to create a better future. Families who had once lived in fear of the bikers now saw them as allies, working together to improve their neighborhood. And Bruce? Though he remained largely unknown to most people, his influence endured. Stories of his encounters, like the DC one at Joe's Tavern, were passed down, inspiring countless individuals to seek strength through understanding rather than aggression. For Bruce, that was all the recognition he needed. His mission wasn't about fame or glory. It was about planting seeds of change and trusting others to nurture them. In the end, the story of that fateful night served as a reminder of something profound. True strength isn't about dominance or force. It's about the courage to rise above anger, the wisdom to choose compassion over conflict, and the willingness to inspire others to do the same. Whether it was Jake finding redemption, Emily discovering hope, or Bruce quietly shaping the world around him, the ripple effects of that single moment proved that even the smallest actions could lead to extraordinary transformations.